Now, neither P nor N by itself would be of any good to us. What we will look upon is a concoction of a p-type and n-type semiconductor. We will have them simultaneously present in an electrical arrangement and make electrical sense of it, right? So what is done is, I take a single crystal of a semiconductor. I take a single crystal, say this is one single crystal of an intrinsic semiconductor. Single crystal. And one half of this crystal is doped one way, the other half is doped the other way. What I do is, let's say these are the two parts of the single crystal. We take a single crystal of an intrinsic variety. I now dope it, but not uniform doping, not the same kind of doping in the two halves of the crystal, right? This is one half of the crystal, this is the other half of the crystal, right? I dope this half as p-type. That means I use a trivalent impurity to dope this. What would it give me? It would give me large number of holes as majority charge carriers and traces of electrons as minority charge carriers. That's a p-type doping, right? So there is a p-type doping here, a large number of holes, large number of holes here. And they would be, these would be majority charge carriers, right? And there would be traces of electrons. There would be traces of electrons. And electrons would be minority charge carriers there. That's a p-type doping. All of this on a bed of boron atoms. All of this on a bed of boron atoms. Think of it like this. Think of this as a bed of boron atoms, and there is a gas of holes. Imagine this to be a gas of holes, right? Think of it. Because the gas can move, the boron atoms will not move, right? So there are these holes, majority charge carriers, there are these electrons that are minority charge carriers, right, in the p-type. The other half is doped as n-type. N-type. And in the n-type, I dope it with a pentavalent impurity, and I create a large number of free electrons belonging to the conduction band and traces of holes belonging to the valence band. That's the n-type. So large number of electrons on a bed of phosphorus atoms, on a bed of immobile phosphorus atoms. So these, think of this as a gas of electrons. Think of this as a gas of electrons, right? Large number of electrons and traces of holes. There are traces of holes here. Holes majority charge carriers, electrons minority charge carriers here. In this n-type, electrons majority charge carriers, holes minority charge carriers. Yes or no? Imagine that these are two chambers, these are two gas chambers. This is one gas chamber containing large number of holes. This is another gas chamber containing fewer number of holes. This gas chamber contains large number of electrons, and this gas chamber contains fewer electrons, right? And say this was a partition, I dissolve this partition, I remove this partition. When I remove this partition, if I imagine this to be two gases, then the gases would diffuse. The gases would diffuse, right? Now, what becomes the premise for diffusion? So there would be diffusion that takes place here. Let's understand. Diffusion occurs. Right? There is diffusion. Now, what would be the premise of diffusion? What causes diffusion? Difference in concentration levels. Diffusion is caused by difference in concentration levels, right? This region is high concentration of holes, This region is low concentration of holes. This region is low concentration of holes. Would you then not want to believe that holes will diffuse from the p type to the n type, right? So holes start diffusing from p to n. Holes start to diffuse this way. Holes start to diffuse this way. There is a hole current because of diffusion. There is a hole current because of diffusion. Now, don't even imagine that, you know, it's as if these holes are getting attracted to electrons. No. This diffusion is not because of electrical attraction. Diffusion is because of difference in concentration levels. That far and no further. Diffusion current is only because of difference in concentration levels. Only because of difference in concentration levels that diffusion occurs. Am I sure? Now, what about electrons? High concentration of electrons here. So, diffusion current because of holes is like this. I diffusion because of holes. I diffusion because of holes is from left to right. Is from left to right. Now, what is this? High concentration of electrons. This n-type is very high concentration of electrons. So, this is high concentration of electrons. What is this? These are minority charge carriers, very low concentration of electrons. So there is a difference in concentration levels of electrons from here to here. That means there is going to be electrons that would diffuse from n-type to p-type. Electrons diffuse this way. Electrons diffuse from right to left. Yes or no? Only because of difference in concentration level. Don't think that the holes and electrons are getting attracted. No, they are diffusing because of difference in concentration only. Right? Now if electrons, so whole current is from left to right. And electrons are diffusing from right to left. It's as if positive charges are diffusing from left to right. If holes are diffusing from right to left, it's as if positive charges are diffusing from left to right. That means the diffusion of electrons will also produce a current in the same direction. I diffusion of electrons, which actually happens from right to left, but then if electrons diffuse from right to left, it's as if positive charges are diffusing from left to right. That means the diffusion current because of electrons is also in the same direction. The diffusion current for holes and electrons, they augment each other, they strengthen each other. They're in the same direction from p-type to n-type, yes or no? Hai na? Now, and this process of diffusion starts the moment the doping has taken place. This process of diffusion commences. Now, the important thing is what happens because of this diffusion. Look, let me look at the layer of phosphorus. So there are ample charge carriers here and there are ample charge carriers here. And by the way, What is the net charge in a p-type? What is the net charge in a p-type semiconductor? What is the net charge in a p-type? No, it's neutral. So what if there are so many holes? There are that many negative boron ions also. The boron atoms that we doped it with were neutral. The silicon atoms were neutral. Where would that extra charge come from? The whole arrangement is still electrically neutral. The charge carriers now have differential numbers, but the whole arrangement is still electrically neutral. So this was neutral. The p-type was neutral. I mean, I can't create charge. I had neutral boron atoms and I had neutral silicon atoms eventually. Right now? So there would be neutrality. There would be electrical neutrality in the p-type. What about n-type? Same thing. That will also be electrically neutral. Where will I get that extra charge? The whole thing would have no net charge. This will also be neutral. Yet, there are charge carriers here. This region has charge carriers negative predominantly. This region has charge carriers, holes predominantly, which could be treated like positive charges. Right? Now, once this process of diffusion starts owing to difference in concentration levels, look at, see, there is a layer of boron here close to the junction. There is a layer of phosphorus here close to the junction. Yes or no? Let me just draw that. Close to the junction. This is my p-type. This is my n-type. Boron, that was negative, and there was a hole produced by boron, right? Boron negative and a hole, boron negative and a hole, boron negative and a hole, boron negative and a hole. And this layer is going to be, let's say, a layer of phosphorus ions, right? Right after, this was my junction J. This was the junction J. So, to the right of the junction, I would have imagined positive phosphorus ions, each accompanied with a free electron, let's say. It's not like they are present together, it's only a symbolic representation. Electron, phosphorus plus, minus, phosphorus plus, minus, phosphorus plus, minus. And then, of course, in this region, large number of holes, and there were traces of electrons. In this region, large number of electrons, and there were traces of holes. Yes or no? This was my n-type. Now, the electrons from n-type would diffuse into the p-type because of difference in concentration levels. Because of difference in concentration levels. Now, this electron would want to cross over to the p-type. Moment it crosses over to the p-type, it encounters it encounters a hole, it recombines with a hole and destroys the hole. Yes or no? This was a neutral layer. This was also a neutral layer. See, this was boron minus and one hole, neutral, boron minus one hole. This was a neutral layer. This was also a neutral layer. But now see what happens because of diffusion. Please take cognizance of this. And this part is still neutral. This part is still neutral. This electron would diffuse into this region, will destroy this hole. This electron 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 will destroy this hole. That means now, do you realize in this layer, the charge carriers have got destroyed? In this layer, also the charge carriers have got destroyed. Right? The charge carriers have got destroyed. Right? In this region and this region. Yes or no? That means, but in this region there are enough charge carriers. In this region there are enough charge carriers. But in this layer, two layers, neighboring layers across the junction, they have, what we say, they have got depleted. There is then what's called a depletion layer produced, because in this now holes and electrons, electrons and holes have recombined to destroy each other, right? So charge carriers have got depleted in this region, in this layer, over this layer, charge carriers have got depleted, right? So what starts to build up is a depletion layer. What starts to build up is a depletion layer. Depletion layer builds up. Depletion layer builds up. Electrons and holes consume each other. The free charge carriers across these two layers would have got destroyed. Now, once these electrons and holes destroy each other, so I remove the electron, I remove this hole, I remove this electron, I remove this hole, I remove this electron, this hole, this electron, this hole, this electron, this hole, I remove, right? Now do you see that this layer will no longer be electrically neutral? This would be a net positive charge. This layer would be a net negative charge. It's no longer a neutral layer. These layers now have charge. These layers now have charge. Yes or no? So which means this layer, they were holes, they were minority charge carriers, there were electrons, majority charge carriers here, and there were holes that were minority charge carriers here. And across the junction, let's say this layer and this layer, they have got depleted. They have no charge carriers. They have no charge carriers, but they have charge. There are no charge carriers, but this layer is now positively charged, this layer is negatively charged, but they do not have charge carriers. They do not have charge carriers. That's why I call this layer a depletion layer. That's why I call this a depletion layer, right? So now what happens is this layer, then this layer, for example, becomes positively charged, and this layer becomes negatively charged. Yes or no? Now, you might be tempted to believe that when this process of diffusion starts, when this process of diffusion, holes from here to here and electrons from here to here, because of difference in concentration levels, you know, eventually all holes and electrons will destroy each other. This is what you might be wanting to believe, that all holes and electrons will consume each other and there would be no charge carriers available. There would be no charge carriers available. Not true. What really happens is, see, there is built-up of depletion layer. There is built-up of depletion layer. And it's as if this is positively charged, as if this is negatively charged, this layer and this layer. So you would expect an electric field in this direction across the depletion layer. You would expect an electric field across the depletion layer. Yes or no? Right? Now, if there is this electric field, what does it do? It starts to, see, these holes that are diffusing into this region, that were diffusing into this region, earlier they were doing it very freely because there was no opposition to that diffusion. There was no opposition to that diffusion. Now what happens is, since effectively they behave like positive charges would find it difficult to move against the electric field. Positive charges are encouraged to move in the direction of the electric field. So these holes find this electric field a stumbling block to move over, to get diffused into the n-type. These holes from the p-type, these holes that were conveniently diffusing from p to n, now find this electric field an opposition, a stumbling block. Yes or no? Similarly, look at the electrons that were very freely diffusing from n-type to p-type here. Now, electrons cannot be favored to move in the direction of the electric field. So that means these electrons now are discouraged to move in this direction because of the presence of this electric field created by who? Created by the depletion layer. How does the depletion layer build up? Because of diffusion. Diffusion was the mother of the depletion layer, right? And the depletion layer itself opposed diffusion, right? That's the irony. So the depletion layer was created out of diffusion, But then once this depletion layer starts to build up, it discourages diffusion. Yes or no? Do you realize, all of you understand this? This depletion layer will oppose diffusion. And then, with passage of time, yet, so obviously the rate of diffusion will decrease. The rate of diffusion will decrease, but the diffusion still takes place. Diffusion will still take place, but at a decreasing rate, because you would still find some holes here energetic enough to cross past the electric field. See, if there is a hole here and it has enough energy, it can go past this barrier. It can go past this barrier. It can diffuse into this region. So, however, there'll be fewer in number. So, diffusion rate decreases. Diffusion current decreases. Diffusion current decreases. Decreases. Realize the net diffusion current was from P to N. Net diffusion current ID was from P to N. Diffusion current was from P to N. Because of the holes and electrons both, the net was from P to N. Diffusion current. But it decreases because there is built up of an opposing electric field. There is built up of an opposing electric field. Realize that nevertheless, once diffusion, more and more diffusion happens, although at a decreasing rate, there will still be more and more diffusion from right to left and left to right. The depletion layer will grow in stature. The depletion layer will grow in stature, right? Because more and more electrons and holes will recombine and will destroy each other, adding to a wider depletion layer, Yes or no? That means, if this depletion layer grows, eventually the electric field will grow. Eventually what happens is, see, there is this point is at a potential V1. This is at a potential V2. In the direction of the electric field, what happens? Potential decreases. So V1 is more than V2 very clearly. So there is a potential hill created. This region is at potential V1. Across the depletion layer, it gradually dips to V2. There is a potential hill. The N-type being at a higher potential compared to the P-type. N-type being V1 and P-type being lower, which is V2. Because of the electric field. This is the potential gradient. But the height of the hill, which is difference between V1 and V2. That's called a potential barrier. It is because of this potential barrier. See, this hole, now V2 is less than V1. If this hole has to go to a higher potential, it has to be energized. Because imagine a hole to be like a positive charge. So if you want an electron to, if you want a positive charge to go from lower to higher potential, you will have to energize it, isn't it? A positive charge would have to be energized so that it can migrate to a higher echelon of potential, right? Yes or no? So which means now if this hole has to come down here, how can you do that? It has to, its potential levels are commensurate with V2 here, its potential levels are commensurate with V1 here. Yes, is because of the depletion layer, Earlier there was no potential barrier. The depletion layer created this electric field and therefore this potential barrier. Right? Now, this guy has energy. A hole has energy commensurate with V2. If it wants to go to this point, it would have to be elevated in energy, right? So, either it has to be externally inseminated, or some of these holes are still energetic enough to cross this barrier, to overcome this barrier. It's a barrier for flow of holes from here to here and flow of electrons from here to here. Electrons likewise can't move from here to here because, you know, electrons will not go downhill. Electrons will not go downhill. Positive charges will not go uphill. Electrons will not go downhill on their own. You have to energize a positive charge or something that behaves like a positive charge so that it goes uphill. A negative charge, again you have to energize it so that it goes downhill. It will not happen all by themselves. But there are some holes that still have the energy to overcome this barrier and they go from here to here. Some electrons have enough energy to migrate from this region to this region, and there is still a marginal diffusion current prevalent. But this depletion layer grows. This depletion layer grows. As more and more diffusion occurs, even though at a decreasing rate, the depletion layer will grow in stature. The width of the depletion layer grows. Why do I call it a depletion layer? Because there are no charge carriers here. Charge carriers have recombined to create this depletion layer. They have killed each other to create this depletion layer, right? And now, the depletion layer grows. And the potential barrier grows. The potential barrier grows. Width of the depletion layer will increase. Width of depletion layer increases. Width of depletion layer increases. Potential barrier, which is the height of this hill, potential hill, which is the height of this potential hill, grows. Potential barrier grows. Grows. Diffusion becomes more and more difficult. Diffusion becomes more and more difficult. Diffusion current decreases. Diffusion becomes more and more difficult. Diffusion current decreases. Diffusion current decreases. Right? And if diffusion current, so this is what is happening as far as diffusion is concerned. The width of this depletion region is growing, and this is my P type, this is my N type. This portion is still electrically neutral. This portion is still electrically neutral. This portion is not neutral. This portion is negatively charged. This portion is positively charged, but does not have charge carriers. But does not have charge carriers. There is an electric field like this, and there is a potential hill that is produced here, which has a potential height, and this is a potential barrier. This is a potential barrier delta V. This is a potential barrier delta V. Right? So that's as far as the flow of majority charge carriers. Majority charge carriers have constituted the diffusion current. Majority charge carriers have been instrumental in producing diffusion current, right? However, look at these traces of minority charge carriers. Minority charge carriers are electrons here, and minority charge carriers are holes here, right? Minority charge carriers electrons in the P type and holes in the N type. Yes or no? Right now? Now, look, holes can move in the direction of the electric field, and electrons can move opposite to the electric field because of natural consequences, right? So even though the diffusion current has decreased, minority charge carriers minority charge carriers means electrons on this side and holes on this side. They are favored by the electric field. They are favored by the electric field. Minority charge carriers favored by the potential barrier. Are favored by the potential barrier. And more the potential barrier, the more would be the flow of minority charge carriers from one region to another. Yes or no? If this potential difference grows, more and more electrons which are minority charge carriers can go from P to N type. More and more holes from N type can migrate into P type. That means now I have holes, I have electrons drifting from P to N, and I have holes drifting from N to P. Minority charge carriers, right? Electrons drifting from P to N and holes drifting from N to P. Now this is not because of diffusion. This effect is not because of diffusion. It's because of the electrical impact produced by E. The potential barrier has favored this. It is not diffusion anymore. It's not diffusion anymore, right? So if electrons go from here to here, that means they produce a current in this direction. I'm looking at the minority charge carriers, which can go, negative charges can go from lower to higher potential all by themselves. Positive charge carriers can go from higher to lower potentials all by themselves. So electrons, minority charge carriers, accomplish this transition, right? Right? Electrons go this way. And holes, which are minority charge carriers in the N type, can go this way. Now electrons going this way is like a current in this direction. If electrons are going from here to here, what's the direction of the current? The current then will be like this, yes or no? Opposite to the direction of flow of electrons, right? And if holes are going from here to here, what would be the direction of the current? This way. That means because of holes and because of electrons, both the current is from N to P. Because of holes and because of electrons, which are minority charge carriers now, there is flow of current from N to P. समझ में आया? No? Right? But this current produced is not out of diffusion. It's a drift current. This current is drift. This is not diffusion. It's a I drift. And do you realize, as the potential barrier grows, drift current will increase. And what will happen to the diffusion current? It will decrease. And do you see that diffusion current is like this? Diffusion current is from P to N, whereas drift current is from N to P. Diffusion current decreases with the growth of this hill, and drift current increases with the growth of this hill. Yes or no? Eventually, what would happen is that they would balance each other and there would be no further flow. Eventually, they would balance each other and there would be no further flow of charge across this barrier. The diffusion current would exactly counter the drift current, and there would be no further flow of charge. The depletion layer would then have produced equilibrium. You know what I'm saying? The diffusion current cancelled exactly by the drift current. Drift current because of the electric field, but diffusion current because of difference in concentration level. Difference in concentration level is decreasing, so drift current is decreasing. But electric field is favoring flow of minority charge carriers, resulting in a drift current. Growth of potential barrier means growth of drift current. More and more of minority charge carriers will be favored to flow past the barrier. Yes or no? Eventually, it's not like diffusion will happen forever. It's not like drift will happen forever. It's not like the potential build-up of potential barrier will happen forever. After a while, this will acquire a static scenario. What happens is, in a typical silicon type of semiconductor, doped silicon semiconductor of PN type, what happens is that this would be my P type, this would be my n-type, and there is going to be a potential hill here. There is going to be a potential hill. This would be at a higher potential compared to this. Typically for silicon doped as P on one side and N on another side, roughly, this potential hill has a height of 0.7 volts. Has a height of 0.7 volts. That's an equilibrium potential barrier. That's an equilibrium potential barrier. The n-type would be 0.7 volts higher than the p-type. The n-type would be 0.7 volts higher than the p-type. That is what happens. So now we understand what has electrically transpired in a PN type semiconductor. And you know, the whole thing, I must tell you, is not created out of two different crystals, because if you create a crystal of p-type and you separately create a crystal of n-type and you try and accomplish a physical join, then there would always be an air gap, and all of this will fail. That air gap by itself would be a tremendous will have a tremendous insulating effect, right? Now, in order that the interaction is at the atomic level, it must be made out of the same crystal. One part of the crystal doped as p-type, the other part of the crystal doped as n-type, not two crystals physically joined with an adhesive Fevicol or dendrite, right? Clear?